For months, rumors swirled through the hollers of Odd, West Virginia. Whispers in grocery aisles, Facebook threads, and back porch conversations all carried the same question. Did Betty really do it? The Whittaker name had once been a curiosity, a family known from viral videos, their simple life capturing millions online. But now, it carried the weight of suspicion. The laughter and fascination had faded, replaced by court dates, sealed records, and the echo of unanswered questions. On a chilly Monday morning, the courthouse doors creaked open. Betty Whittaker, frail and visibly trembling, walked in wearing a faded blue sweater and holding a worn envelope in her hand. Her hair was pinned back unevenly. Her eyes, red from sleepless nights, darted nervously at the room filled with unfamiliar faces. There were no cameras allowed inside, no journalists shouting questions, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of papers as the court clerk called her case. When the judge finally said, "State of West Virginia versus Betty L. Whittaker," the air shifted. It wasn't just another hearing. This was Betty's first time speaking publicly since the allegations surfaced, since Adult Protective Services removed her siblings, Lorraine, Timmy, and Ray, from the only home they had ever known. The allegations and the weight of silence. According to the documents, the county alleged neglect and potential abuse. The claims came after Lorraine was reportedly seen with a bruised arm, a video that circulated online and set off a storm of public outrage. Betty had never spoken about it. Until now, when a judge asked if she understood the charges, Betty's voice cracked. "I do, Your Honor, but I didn't hurt nobody. I swear I didn't." Her attorney, a young public defender named Allison Pierce, gently placed a hand on Betty's shoulder. She whispered something, maybe a reminder to breathe. Allison then stood and addressed the court. "My client has spent decades caring for her siblings without support. She has no criminal record. She is not an abuser. She's a caretaker who fell through the cracks of a system that never showed up until it was too late." There was a murmur in the courtroom. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp glasses, shuffled his papers before responding. "The state is not accusing Ms. Whittaker of malice. We are alleging neglect. The living conditions documented on site were unsafe, unsanitary, and dangerous for individuals with severe disabilities." Betty turned her head slightly and whispered under her breath, "It was home." Inside the courtroom, a few spectators sat quietly in the back. Some locals, some family friends, one or two familiar faces from church. None of them spoke. They just watched as Betty tried to steady her hands while clutching a tissue that had long since lost its shape. The court presented the photos. Dirty floors, broken windows, a cluttered kitchen, torn furniture. Each image made Betty's shoulders tighten a little more. When a photo of Lorraine's bruise appeared on the screen, Betty closed her eyes. That mark, the prosecutor said, was consistent with either restraint or physical contact. Allison objected immediately. "Speculative." The judge nodded, striking the statement from the record, but the damage was already done. The room had felt the implication. Betty's lips quivered. Finally, she whispered, "She fell. She always Fallon. I told him that." Her attorney squeezed her arm gently, signaling her to stay calm. A voice trembling but determined. When it was her turn to speak directly, Betty took a deep breath. Her voice was soft but sharp with pain. "I raised him. Since I was 19, I've been taking care of him. Mama died, Daddy was gone, and it was just us left in that house. Nobody came to help. Nobody. Not a soul. We didn't have much, but we loved each other." She paused, pressing the tissue to her face. The judge let her take a moment. "Lorraine, she's like a child. We don't talk much, but he smiles when I sing. And Timmy, he draws pictures. I made sure they ate every day. I made sure they were warm in the winter. I didn't hit nobody. Never. but I yelled sometimes. Lord knows I did. You'd yell too if you was trying to do everything alone." Her words cracked on the last sentence. The courtroom stayed silent. A few sniffles echoed from the back row. Even the prosecutor avoided her eyes. The hidden pressure behind the case. Court observers noted that much of the case was built not on physical evidence, but on circumstance and testimony, particularly the viral video that had been circulated online alongside reports from Adult Protective Services. The court heard that Eric, Carol, and Patrick R., two men who had been involved with the family through videos and donations, were among the first to contact authorities after the footage surfaced. Betty mentioned their names briefly. They came round with cameras. They said they was help in, and I believe him. But after they left, everything got worse. I told him not to show us like that. Not when we wasn't looking our best. There was an ache in her tone, the sound of someone who'd been turned into a story without consent. The judge interrupted softly. "Ms. Whittaker, please keep your comments directed to the matter of care and supervision." "Yes, ma'am," Betty said, voice trembling. "All I'm saying is, they made us look like monsters. But we was just living the testimony of a social worker. The prosecution called in the county social worker who had visited the Whittaker home after receiving multiple reports. Her testimony was clinical but emotional. When I arrived, the environment was unfit for continued residence without intervention. The family's basic needs were being met inconsistently. While Ms. Whittaker appeared devoted to her siblings, her capacity to manage their care had clearly diminished. When asked if she believed abuse had occurred, the worker paused. "I can't say that it was intentional harm, but I can say that it was unsafe." Betty's head dropped. "Unsafe?" she whispered. "That's our home you talking about." Her lawyer whispered again, "Don't respond, Betty." But Betty couldn't help herself. They always say unsafe when poor folks try to make do. We didn't have no fancy doctor or maid. Just me. What did they expect? The judge raised a hand gently. "Ms. Whittaker, I understand this is emotional, but please allow the process to continue." The moment that broke her. As the morning dragged into afternoon, Betty's exhaustion became visible. She dabbed her face, wrung her hands, and stared at the empty space where her siblings once sat beside her. When asked if she knew where they were placed after removal, Betty hesitated. "No, ma'am. They won't tell me. I send letters. I don't know if they get 'em." Her voice cracked again. "I dream about Lorraine crying. I wake up counting her name. Sometimes I still set the table for 4. I know they ain't coming home, but it feels wrong to eat alone." Even the court reporter paused for a second before continuing to type. The judge's face softened slightly. "We'll note your statement, Ms. Whittaker." Outside the court, by the time the hearing ended, the sun had already begun to set. Betty walked out quietly, holding her envelope, the one she never opened during the entire session. When a local reporter asked if she wanted to make a statement, she stopped, looked down at the courthouse steps, and said, "You tell 'em I didn't hurt my family. I just got tired. That's all." Then she walked away, leaving behind a trail of murmurs, sympathy, and speculation. Back inside, the clerk filed the paperwork, sealed, confidential, untouchable by the public. But those who were there that day didn't need access to the records. They'd seen the story play out in real time. A woman, weathered by years of isolation, finally breaking under the weight of judgment from the system, from the internet, and from herself. What do you think after hearing Betty's words in court? Was she a victim of exhaustion or someone who went too far without realizing it? Comment below, not with judgment, but with what your heart feels after hearing her side. The courtroom emptied slowly that afternoon, but the tension clung to the walls long after the last footsteps faded. Betty Whittaker's trembling testimony had left a silence behind, one that no one seemed to know how to fill. Outside, reporters waited, but no official statements were made. The judge had ordered all Adult Protective Services evidence to remain sealed, citing confidentiality laws. What the public didn't see, what the cameras weren't allowed to capture, was what unfolded behind those closed doors after the recess. When the court reconvened, the tone changed. This wasn't about sympathy anymore. It was about accountability, evidence, and a family torn apart by neglect, exhaustion, and a system's slow collapse. The private evidence review. The courtroom was cleared of spectators for the next session. Only Betty, her lawyer, the prosecutor, and the judge remained, along with a handful of APS officials and a stenographer. On the table sat a thick folder labeled Confidential, APS case hashtag 2387BW. The prosecutor opened it, revealing pages of reports, photos, and statements. "Your Honor," he began, "this is the result of a 6-month investigation into the welfare of Lorraine, Timmy, and Ray Whittaker. The evidence suggests that Ms. Whittaker, while their caretaker, was unable to maintain conditions suitable for their health and safety." Betty leaned forward, her face pale. She whispered, "I did my best." Her attorney spoke softly. "We understand, Betty. Just listen for now." The prosecutor continued, "We are not alleging intentional harm. We are presenting a case of chronic neglect, one that may stem from caregiver burnout, poverty, and lack of community support. However, the state cannot ignore the consequences." He then handed the judge a sealed report. Inside were photographs never released to the public: Lorraine's injured arm, Ray's untreated rash, and Timmy's room, bare except for papers, crayons, and a pile of clothes. Betty turned her head away, tears filling her eyes. "That's not how it always looked," she muttered. The psychological evaluation. Next came a testimony from a licensed psychologist who had visited the home prior to the removal. "It's clear Ms. Whittaker loves her siblings deeply," she said, her voice steady. "But love alone cannot replace structured care. Ms. Whittaker displayed signs of extreme fatigue, disorientation, and symptoms consistent with depression. Her home environment mirrored her mental state, chaotic but not cruel." Betty's attorney nodded. "So you're saying she was overwhelmed, not malicious?" "Exactly," the psychologist replied. "This is a case where intervention was needed, not punishment. However, once media attention entered the picture, the situation escalated beyond repair." The judge scribbled notes. Everyone in the room knew what she meant. Once the world discovered the Whittakers through documentaries, interviews, and endless social media speculation, they were no longer just a family. They were content. And the consequences of that exposure had now spiraled into a legal and emotional nightmare. Betty speaks again. The judge gave Betty another chance to address the court privately. She stood slowly, holding the edges of the table for balance. Her hands trembled, but her voice, though broken, carried the weight of decades. "I didn't know what I was doing wrong," she began. "All I knew was taking care of them. I wash them, I fed them, I kept the heat on best I could. Sometimes it was hard, real hard, but I never thought I was hurting them. I thought I was protecting him from the world." Her attorney asked gently, "Why didn't you ask for help?" Betty let out a bitter laugh, more like a sigh. "Who was I supposed to ask? Folks out here barely take care of their own. Why did call once? Years ago, they said we'd get someone to come by and check in. Nobody ever showed. So I stopped asking." The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Whittaker, no one doubts your love for your family. But we have to determine whether your home was safe, regardless of intent." "It was home," Betty said quietly. "Safe ain't always pretty." APS testimony, what they found. An Adult Protective Services worker took the stand next. She was nervous, glancing often between the judge and her papers. Her report was methodical but heavy. "Upon arrival, I found the environment cluttered with debris, limited food in the kitchen, and minimal sanitation. However, all three dependents appeared fed, clothed, and alert. The primary concerns involved hygiene, medical neglect, and structural hazards within the home. The prosecutor asked, "Did you observe signs of abuse?" The worker hesitated, not in the traditional sense. There were no deliberate injuries or overt signs of physical harm. But Lorraine did have a bruise that raised concern. When asked about it, she was unable to explain how it occurred. Ms. Whittaker insisted it was from a fall. Betty's attorney interrupted. "And was there any evidence proving otherwise?" "No," the worker admitted. "There was no direct evidence of assault." Betty exhaled shakily, her relief quickly swallowed by exhaustion. The community's role. Part of the testimony included statements from neighbors. Some described Betty as a devoted sister who did everything alone. Others painted a different picture, calling her standoffish, private, and easily frustrated. One note read, "She'd yell sometimes. You could hear her from down the road. But she never seemed cruel, just tired." The judge read it aloud, then looked up at Betty. "Ms. Whittaker, do you acknowledge that you sometimes raised your voice or became angry with your siblings?" Betty nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I ain't perfect. Sometimes they wouldn't listen, and I'd get mad. But I never laid a hand on 'em in anger. Never." The judge paused. Anger doesn't always mean abuse, but it can lead to mistakes. "Do you regret how you handled things?" Betty's voice cracked. Every day, the emotional breakdown. As the questioning went on, Betty began to unravel. Her words spilled out faster, emotion overtaking reason. "I know what they think, that I was keeping them like animals. But that's a lie. You can't take care of folks like that without getting dirty. You can't feed him, wash him, change him, and keep everything perfect. I tried. I did. But I got old. My hands hurt. My mind don't work like it used to. I begged for help. Nobody came." Her attorney placed a hand on her back, but Betty continued, almost pleading. "Now they're gone. I don't know where they sleep or who feeds them. I ain't heard Lorraine's voice in months. I don't even know if she remembers me. Tell me how that's supposed to make sense." For a brief moment, the courtroom wasn't a courtroom. It was a confession booth. A woman breaking under the weight of years of survival, now being punished for the very thing she sacrificed her life to do. The judge's pause. After several hours, the judge called for a break. The courtroom emptied again, leaving only Betty and her attorney at the table. Betty leaned over and whispered, "You think they'll let me see him again?" Her attorney hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'll try my best, Betty. That's all I can promise." Betty nodded weakly, staring at her hands. "It ain't right," she murmured. "I kept him alive all this time, and now they say I'm the danger." When court resumed, the judge addressed everyone firmly. "This case is about more than one family. It's about a community that failed to support them, a system that intervened too late, and a woman caught in the middle. I will deliberate on the evidence, but I urge both parties to remember, compassion and accountability are not enemies." Then she adjourned for the day. Betty gathered her papers slowly. Before leaving, she looked toward the judge and said softly, "Thank you for listening, Your Honor. That's all I ever wanted." Outside the courthouse, by the time she stepped outside, night had fallen. The air was crisp, and the courthouse lights flickered against the pavement. A few locals lingered nearby, whispering, waiting to see her reaction. But Betty didn't speak to them. She simply looked up at the sky, the same sky that hung over her sibling somewhere out there, and whispered something no one could hear. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was goodbye. Do you believe Betty's exhaustion justifies her mistakes? Should the court see her as guilty of neglect, or as a woman failed by the system? Comment below and share your thoughts with compassion, because this story is more than a case file. It's a reflection of what happens when love, poverty, and isolation collide. The morning after the hearing, the small town of Odd, West Virginia, buzzed with quiet speculation. The courthouse lights were off, but whispers still lingered in the diner, the post office, and every gas station where the Whittaker name was mentioned. Some believed Betty would get her siblings back. Others said it was over, that the state would never return them after what had been shown in court. No one, however, knew the whole story. Because behind sealed doors, one voice had finally emerged, the voice of Lorraine. Lorraine's statement. For months, Lorraine hadn't spoken to anyone outside her family. Her words, when they came, were often fragmented, soft sounds, sometimes laughter, sometimes confusion. But in the weeks after being placed in state care, Lorraine had reportedly begun to speak more clearly, at least according to a social worker's written notes. Her statement, read in court by her appointed guardian, was brief and heartbreaking. I miss home. I miss Betty. I want my things. I want my bed. I want the house with the creek. Then a pause. The next line was softer, harder to understand. Betty hurt my arm when she got mad. She said sorry. Those words echoed through the courtroom like a whisper caught in the wind. Barely there, but heavy enough to shift the tone of everything that followed. Betty's head dropped. Her attorney closed her eyes. The prosecutor glanced down, unwilling to look at her. The judge said gently, "For the record, Ms. Whittaker, you may respond." Betty took a trembling breath. She's right. I got mad. She fell, and I pulled her up too hard. I didn't mean to hurt her. I said sorry, and I cried all night. She knows I did. She knows I didn't mean it. Her voice broke. I was just tired. I ain't no monster. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. For a moment, the legal jargon faded away. It wasn't about guardianship or case numbers anymore. It was about a family that had broken under the weight of love and exhaustion. The investigation's turning point. After Lorraine's words were read, APS presented additional findings. The report included visits from earlier that year, some documented by photos never meant for public eyes. There were notes written by the caseworker. House cluttered, but not hazardous. Lorraine calm, communicative. Timmy drawing on porch. Betty crying during interview. Expressed guilt and fear of losing them. But later entries painted a different picture. Sanitation worsening. Lorraine's arm injury noted. Betty increasingly paranoid about visitors. The shift between the two sets of notes was striking. Something had changed inside that house. One of the APS workers, during testimony, described that change. When I first met Ms. Whittaker, she was cooperative but exhausted. By the second visit, she was withdrawn and suspicious. She said people were using her family for videos and money. She said she didn't trust anyone anymore. The prosecutor leaned forward. Did you believe her? The worker hesitated. At first, no. But over time, I think she was right about some of it. The exploitation factor. As the hearing continued, the topic no one wanted to say aloud finally surfaced: exploitation. Betty's lawyer turned to the judge and spoke firmly. Your Honor, this case didn't begin because of state oversight. It began because of the internet. Because people saw the Whittakers as a spectacle, not a family. And once the cameras left, they were worse off than before. The prosecutor interjected, that may be true, but the exposure isn't on trial here. But it should be the defense shot back. Because the truth is, if the Whittakers hadn't been filmed and turned into a viral curiosity, none of us would be here today. Betty's so-called neglect came after that media storm. Donations came, but so did chaos. She was given attention, not help. Viewers watched, commented, and left. And what was left behind? A family stripped bare. The judge remained quiet for a long moment before responding. That may not be legally relevant, but it is morally relevant. The court acknowledges that public interference played a role in this case's deterioration. Betty's eyes filled with tears again. "They laughed at us," she whispered. "They said we was weird. But nobody saw the nights I sat up with Lorraine when she was sick. Nobody saw me praying for money for medicine. They just saw what they wanted to see." Her lawyer put a hand on hers, whispering, "You're doing good, Betty. Just keep telling the truth." Timmy's note. Later that afternoon, a final piece of evidence was presented, a short note written in colored pencil. It had been found in one of Timmy's sketchbooks during the APS visit. It read, "Betty makes soup. Lorraine cries. I don't like the camera. I want to go to the creek. I love home." It wasn't proof of neglect. It wasn't proof of innocence either. It was simply proof of humanity, a reminder that behind every accusation and legal term were people who once sat together at a table and called it life. Betty looked at the paper and whispered, "That's Timmy's writing. He loves his soup." The judge nodded gently. "We've heard enough for today. I'll review all submitted evidence and testimony before rendering a decision." After the hearing, when the session ended, Betty didn't rush out this time. She sat quietly, her hands folded, staring at the table. Her attorney packed up the files, waiting for her to stand. "You told your truth," Allison said softly. Betty shook her head. "Truth don't mean nothing to people who already decided." Outside, the courthouse steps were empty this time. No cameras, no crowd, no noise. The autumn wind swept across the parking lot, carrying the faint scent of rain. Betty sat on a bench for a long time, staring at the road. Finally, she said quietly, "If they just let me see him once, I could tell him I'm sorry. Not for being poor, not for yelling, just for failing to keep him safe." Her lawyer didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. The public's reaction. That night, the story spread again online. Not through news outlets, but through community posts and social media. Some people were furious at the system. How do you punish a woman for being poor? Others condemned her. You can't excuse neglect just because life was hard. A few voices, quieter but more thoughtful, said something different. Maybe everyone failed the Whittakers. Maybe we all watched too long without helping. Lorraine's whereabouts. Reports surfaced that Lorraine had been placed in a private care facility under state supervision. A nurse familiar with her case, whose name remained undisclosed, later confirmed anonymously that Lorraine still spoke fondly of Betty. "She talks about her all the time," the nurse said. "She says, 'Betty coming soon,' almost every day." When that quote reached the defense team, Betty cried for the first time in weeks, not out of fear but relief. "She remembers me," she whispered. "That's all I needed to know." The waiting game. The next court date was set for 2 weeks later. Until then, all parties were under a strict confidentiality order. No contact, no visits, no calls. Betty returned to her empty home, the same one she had shared for decades with her family, now silent except for the creak of old floorboards and the hum of a fridge that barely worked. She stood by the window, looking out at the creek where Lorraine used to sit and hum to herself. The water shimmered in the fading light. "Still running," Betty murmured. "Just like us." After hearing Lorraine's voice and seeing how the investigation unfolded, what do you believe? Was Betty's love enough to outweigh her mistakes? Or did the system step in too late to save them all? Comment below, and if your heart feels heavy, that's okay. This isn't just a story about blame. It's a story about what happens when love meets loneliness. 2 weeks passed like months. The house in Odd, West Virginia sat quiet again, surrounded by the same patch of trees, the same dirt road, the same creek that always ran no matter who came or went. But this time, there was no laughter, no calling of names, no footsteps shuffling on the porch. Betty Whittaker lived alone, waiting. When the morning of the final hearing arrived, the air outside the courthouse was damp and gray. The clouds hung low, heavy with rain. Betty arrived early, wearing the same blue sweater from the first hearing. Her attorney met her at the steps, holding a folder. "Allison," Betty whispered, "you think I'll get to see him today?" Her lawyer hesitated. "We'll find out soon, Betty. Whatever happens, you spoke your truth. That matters." Betty nodded, but said nothing. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. No cameras, no reporters, just a handful of people: the prosecutor, the judge, 2 APS representatives, and Betty. On the bench behind her sat one familiar face, a local church member who had come simply to sit with her so she ain't alone. The judge's opening words. The judge entered quietly, her voice soft but steady. "We are here to deliver findings in the case of Betty Whittaker and the adult dependents under prior guardianship. I have reviewed all testimony, evidence, and records presented over the past month." She paused and looked directly at Betty. "Ms. Whittaker, before I render my decision, do you have any final statement?" Betty stood slowly. Her voice was calm, but her hand shook. "I just want to see him. I don't care if they don't come home. I just need to see their faces again. That's all." The judge nodded gently. "Thank you, Ms. Whittaker. You may sit." The decision. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the sound of papers turning seemed too loud. After careful review, the judge began. "The court finds that while no evidence of intentional abuse was proven, the environment under Ms. Whittaker's care did present unsafe conditions for individuals requiring full-time supervision." Betty's breath caught. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. The court further recognizes the extraordinary emotional and physical burden Ms. Whittaker carried alone for decades. The state failed to provide adequate assistance and oversight, which contributed to this outcome. The judge's voice softened. "Guardianship will not be returned to Ms. Whittaker at this time. However, the court orders that she be granted supervised visitation once per month at the discretion of Adult Protective Services." For a second, Betty didn't move. She blinked, processing the words. Then a tear slipped down her cheek. "So, I can see him?" she whispered. Her attorney smiled faintly. "Yes, Betty, you can see them." The moment that broke her. The judge continued, her tone respectful. "Ms. Whittaker, this court does not view you as a criminal. You are not being punished, you are being relieved. The state recognizes that you gave your life to your family. What we must do now is ensure that they receive the level of care you alone could not provide." Betty nodded, sobbing quietly. "I tried, Your Honor. Lord knows I tried." "We know you did," the judge said. "And now it's time for others to help carry that burden." The gavel struck softly, one sound that felt like both an ending and a release. After the verdict, outside, the rain had started to fall. Betty stood on the courthouse steps, staring out at the parking lot as puddles began to form. Her attorney handed her a copy of the visitation order. "They said next month," Allison explained. "You'll get to see them in a neutral location, maybe a care facility or APS office." Betty held the paper like it was fragile. "I don't care where. I'll bring them candy. They like that." Her voice trembled with both sadness and hope. A reporter tried to approach, but Allison waved them off. "No statements today." Instead, Betty turned toward the gray sky and whispered, "They'll know I didn't leave him. I never left him." Lorraine's letter. A week later, something unexpected arrived, a letter addressed to Betty. The return label was from the state's adult care facility. Inside was a short, handwritten note in shaky cursive. "Hi, Betty. I saw you on the TV. I miss you. I like my room. They got pudding here. Love, Lorraine." Betty read it over and over until the ink smudged from her tears. She placed it on the table beside a photograph of her and her siblings from years ago, smiling, barefoot in the grass behind the old house. She whispered, "She's okay." And for the first time in months, she smiled. The final farewell. Weeks passed. The world moved on. The internet, once obsessed with the Whittakers, found new stories to consume. But in Odd, West Virginia, the story didn't end. It just grew quieter. The house still stood, leaning slightly against time. The old porch light flickered at night. And sometimes, if you passed by, you might see a woman sitting on the steps, clutching a letter, whispering names to the wind. Betty Whittaker wasn't on camera anymore. There were no donations, no interviews, no attention. Just peace and waiting. One evening, she looked up at the darkening sky and said softly, "They'll come see me soon. The judge said so. I'll make soup." Then she went inside, humming a tune Lorraine used to sing. The screen door creaked shut, and the night swallowed the sound. Another chapter closed. Another truth half forgotten by the world, but not by her. If you were in Betty's shoes, exhausted, isolated, and trying to care for family with no help, what would you have done? Do you believe the judge made the right call? Share your thoughts below, and let's talk about what justice really means when love and survival collide.